And now, please give a warm welcome to the host of Broadway Buzz, Mr. Joe Garrett.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome to Broadway Buzz, and welcome to CATS, the mega musical. You know, when I grew up in the theater, a show was considered successful if it ran one season on Broadway, and it was really a hit if it would transfer to London for a year. But look how times have changed. When we talk about the mega musical, which started with CATS in 1981, because of the genius of the producer Cameron Mackintosh, we very quickly understood that we could very seriously expand the markets for a musical. And it did not simply mean the West End and Broadway. Suddenly, the world was an open market. So we would make Sydney, Australia, a major market. We would make Singapore a market. We would make Vienna a major market. We would make cities in Germany, especially Hamburg and Frankfurt, markets for the musical. And this would spread all through the Orient also. So now we were not talking about a show running for a season, we were talking about a show running for decades. Remember that when CATS opened in London, it would run in the same theater for 21 years, and that would start this whole movement of the mega musical. It would be followed, of course, by Miss Saigon, by Phantom of the Opera, by Les Miserables, and countless shows would then play literally for decades in cities. Keep in mind that in Japan, a production of CATS ran for 36 years. Extraordinary. Okay, so let us go then to the source of all this. All of this began, of course, with the great poet T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, as you remember, was an American who grew up in St. Louis. His family was from Boston. They were patrician, very wealthy, intellectual people. They sent their son to Harvard. He very quickly, upon graduation, moved to England, where he changed his citizenship and would spend his life being considered the great English poet. His greatest work, of course, was a work called Wasteland, and that's a big epic poem that's enormously powerful and dimensional, and certainly worth reading. I read it almost every year. It's so powerful. But keep in mind, the title, Wasteland, would very strongly influence the setting we're going to see in CATS. We see a garbage dump. And so that is the metaphor for wasteland, and so they borrowed from that from T.S. Eliot. But in 1936, T.S. Eliot started writing poems about cats. He would ultimately publish this work, and it would be called Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. And what it was a collection of 14 poems about very eccentric, idiosyncratic, delightful cats. T.S. Eliot spent his whole life loving and collecting cats, and it became, de rigueur for any of his famous friends. If they bought a cat, they always had to call T.S. Eliot, who would name the cat, because he would have such extraordinary names, being the great poet that he was. There's a wonderful number in the show called The Naming of Cats, and that seriously could apply to its author, T.S. Eliot. Okay, so the book was published in 1938. It became an instant bestseller. English grandmothers every year would give that book to their grandchildren, and it was a book that was widely read, not only in England, but literally all over the world. So, enter then Andrew Lloyd Webber. Andrew Lloyd Webber, our great composer, whose career started, of course, with Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, followed by Jesus Christ Superstar, that would transform the musical theater. We would have the first great sort of rock opera. And so we have in the musical theater a performance without any spoken dialogue, just music. So Andrew Lloyd Webber and his partner Tim Rice would literally transform the musical theater. I mean, before Andrew Lloyd Webber, it was an American art form. All the great composer lyricists were American. And now suddenly we have Andrew Lloyd Webber who's going to change this whole dimension. We called it the British invasion, and so he would take over. After the success of Jesus Christ Superstar, the two men, the composer and lyricist, disagreed on what their next project should be. So Andrew Lloyd Webber decided to go off on his own. He had chosen to take the books of P.G. Wodehouse, the wonderful collection of stories about Jeeves the butler, again, very famous in England. And it didn't interest Tim Rice at all. Tim Rice was beginning to toy with the idea of what would be his great musical that would take several years to write, and chess. And so in any case, Andrew Lloyd Webber would pick a great British playwright, Alan Ayckbourn, to write the script and the lyrics for the new By Jeeves musical. Tragically, when it opened, it was 4.5 hours long, and it was a complete catastrophe and very quickly closed. I do want to remind you, Andrew Lloyd Webber never gives up on anything. He would rework that many years later, strip it way down to a very small cast, no scenery, and it would be called Jeeves, and it was enormously successful and very delightful. But in any case, at that moment in Andrew Lloyd Webber's life, it was a very difficult time because critics started saying, well, maybe the real genius in those first two musicals really was Tim Rice. Maybe it was the brilliant lyrics and the brilliant storytelling that made those works so powerful. So very quickly, Andrew Lloyd Webber reconnected with Tim Rice, and they would create the musical Evita, which was an enormous success. But at that point, the two men realized that their careers together had to move in different directions. They had different points of view, they had different projects that they wanted to work on. So the end result was their relationship was over. So this is where we find Andrew Lloyd Webber in 1978. He's without a lyricist and libretto writer, and he's facing what is going to come next. It is at that point that he decided to take the book of Practical Cats, the collection of poetry, and turn it into a musical. Now keep in mind, Andrew Lloyd Webber, in all of his early work with Tim Rice, while the two men collaborated on every song, where it would be placed, who would sing it, what the key should be, what the texture of the song should be, it was always the music that came first. And then Tim Rice would add the lyrics. So in this case, Andrew Lloyd Webber wanted to see if he was flexible enough to take lyrics that are really frozen, in this case, the 14 poems that are in the collection of poetry that we have, and to see if he could create music for each of these poems. In the case of T.S. Eliot, of course, being the master poet that he was, he wrote each poem with a very special cadence, with a very special rhythmic idea, so that when you even speak it aloud, you already start hearing the rhythmic notion of it. And Andrew Lloyd Webber would very cleverly pick up that idea and create this incredible pastiche of songs that would clearly illuminate all of the music. As he was working on this in the 2 years, he didn't think it was going to be significant enough to be a full-blown musical. At this point in Andrew Lloyd Webber's life, he had already created what he called a song cycle. And a song cycle meant several songs built around a theme. And he created this work that was called Tell Me on a Sunday. That solo song became an international hit, incidentally, but he wrote these 10 songs in a song cycle, and it was presented on the BBC and was enormously successful, and he made a lot of money doing it, and it was a lot simpler than creating a new musical. So he was thinking that he was going to develop Cats as a song cycle. Okay, now let me just go back for a moment. The time now again is 1978. Andrew Lloyd Webber has just won the Best Musical Award for Evita at the Olivier Awards in London. And the night he received the award, perhaps he was nervous, I don't know why he spoke so insensitively, but he said, "Thank you very much for this award. I'm very grateful. I'm very sorry my partner and director Hal Prince isn't here to accept the award. He's in New York. But further, I want to say, I wish Hal Prince was here and he could have made sense out of this ramshackle evening." So here he is receiving an award and he's criticizing the event. And the event was produced by Cameron Mackintosh, the great producer. And so they became bitter enemies. They had never met, but Cameron Mackintosh was furious that he would be chided in front of all of his peers when a winner was accepting the award. So for the next 2 years in London, the two artists badmouthed one another. And of course, there are a lot of newspapers in London that love to pick up on stories like that. And so they inflamed all of this, the England's great producer, Cameron Mackintosh, in conflict with Andrew Lloyd Webber, England's great composer. So the media loved all the attention it was getting. In any case, both these men's agents finally got together and said, London is too small a city and the theater is too small a profession to have two of our giants carping about one another. They don't even know one another. So they set up a luncheon. And at this luncheon, 4 bottles of very expensive French wine was downed, and 7 hours later, the two men staggered away, being the best of friends. The next morning, when Andrew Lloyd Webber woke up, he realized that he had promised that Cameron Mackintosh could produce Cats as a full musical on the West End. And so this just happened over drinks. And Cameron Mackintosh took this and ran with it because Cameron Mackintosh had produced several musicals on the West End, but they were revivals. And so this would be his first original musical, and he really ran with it. And he very quickly hired Trevor Nunn to be the director. Many of you know Trevor Nunn was one of the greatest classical directors in England. He ran the Royal Shakespeare Company, and at times he worked at the National Theatre also. So he was the perfect choice. Keep in mind, Trevor Nunn, at that same period, had just done an 8.5-hour version of Nicholas Nickleby. That was a great success at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and then it literally moved around the world in a commercial way. So Trevor Nunn is perfect. He's never done a musical, but he now has a world reputation. He also decided that he wanted to use John Napier, the set designer who had worked on Nicholas Nickleby with him, to do the sets for Cats. So we now, right at the very beginning, have this very esoteric director who's at the top of the heap and admired profoundly at the highest levels of theater in Great Britain, and same is true for the designer. Cameron Mackintosh moved very quickly and then hired Gillian Lind, who was a great British choreographer. First of all, she'd been a great ballet dancer in her own right. She had appeared in West End shows. She choreographed all of the major British shows from the 1960s to the early 1980s. Andrew Lloyd Webber was opposed to this because he considered her sort of old-fashioned, old-school English musical, and he wanted to have a very cutting-edge choreographer. Cameron Mackintosh insisted, and he was right. Very quickly, Gillian Lind, while they were negotiating all this, went off to New York. And I mean, she's one of the preeminent choreographers of the world, keep in mind. And she went to New York and took every cutting-edge dance class she could, so she understood the new vocabulary of dance. I mean, she really had a profound understanding of the world of ballet and the traditional Broadway musical, but now she was really working on the fringe. And so that would serve her very well. Okay, at this point, they realized that Andrew Lloyd Webber has spent 2 years working on Cats, but he never got the rights to it, which is very unusual. I mean, you don't put that kind of investment of time in a project without having the rights. And in this case, you have to have grand rights, which means not only do you have the right to present it as a musical in a legitimate theater, but you have the rights to do the album, to do a movie, to do a television version. It includes everything surrounding the property. So he had to go to the widow of T.S. Eliot. Now, Val, the widow, was not a little retiring English mom who lived in the country raising dogs. She was a very savvy woman who worked in publishing, who helped to make T.S. Eliot the international celebrity that he was, and she guarded his material, in a very profound and knowing way. So they kept prepping Andrew Lloyd Webber for this, knowing that there could be landmines in this negotiation. And so finally he was sent off to meet the widow and to try to get the rights to the T.S. Eliot book of poetry. When he got there, Val, the first thing she said to him is, "What do you think of Walt Disney?" Well, this was sort of a non sequitur, and so Andrew Lloyd Webber wasn't sure how to answer. And so he said, well, as a child, I saw all those movies, and, of course, I adored him as a child, and it transformed my life with all the great cartoons, and he transformed the film industry with animation. And so she said, well, T.S. Eliot hated him. And so Andrew Lloyd Webber pulled back, and, how can anybody hate Walt Disney, And so in any case, she said Walt Disney came to visit them in England, offering them a huge amount of money to present the book of poetry as an animated film. And T.S. Eliot rejected the idea, saying, you talk down to children. No, I don't want you to do it. So the interview did not go well. And obviously, Walt Disney left. And on the way out, T.S. Eliot said, and I didn't like Fantasia either. Well, who doesn't like Fantasia? Okay, so in any case, but this sort of terrified Andrew Lloyd Webber because he was not there to offer a large sum of actual cash the way Walt Disney would have. I mean, in the theater, you work on a royalty basis. So you offer a percentage of the royalty. So, he was not prepared to offer cash. But in any case, the two people got on very well. And at the end of the afternoon, Andrew Lloyd Webber said, in a month, I'm going to be presenting a festival at Sydmonton. Now, remember, Sydmonton is his palatial estate. It's a 4,000-acre estate outside of London. It's one of the great properties of England, and it houses Andrew Lloyd Webber's extraordinary Victorian art collection, so it's an incredible destination if you're lucky enough ever to be invited. And at the festival every year, he would introduce whatever the new show was he was working on. It's where he introduced Phantom of the Opera and Aspects of Love, and Starlight Express. All of his great shows would start with a festival in the fall at Sydmonton. And then all of the very important VIPs of the theater world would come and see what's happening, and hopefully this is where Andrew Lloyd Webber would raise the money to do his next project. So he invited the widow to come to the event in 1980, which was the presentation of, it was called then Practical Cats. And so she arrived. It was very distinguished. The music was delightful. She was thrilled, as everyone else was. And then this list of glittering people who were associated with it, director, designer, choreographer, all A+ first class. And so she said, yes, let's proceed with this. And then in the process, the widow pulled out of her handbag a poem that would change everything. And it was called Grisabella the Glamour Cat. And as you know, Grisabella becomes the central character in the story of Cats. And that simple little 8-line poem would change everything. So it wasn't included in the original publication because the publishers felt it was too adult a story. It's about an old glamour cat who'd lost all her glamour. She says, "I was beautiful once," and so she's sort of at the end of her life and down and out. And so it was not included in the original collection. But it's the perfect meat that we need to link the story. Keep in mind, critics, when they write about this show, complain that there isn't a storyline. Well, let me set us all straight right now. Let me quickly tell you the storyline, so there's no question. It's all there in the poetry. I mean, the critics just aren't listening. In the opening poem, we have a poem called Jellicoe Cats. So we immediately say, what the hell does Jellicoe mean? And in the case of T.S. Eliot, it means a tribe of cats, a group of cats, a collection of cats, street cats, stray cats, and any one of those words apply. He loves to use words. I mean, in that opening poem, they're called Jellicoe Cats, but then there's the Jellicoe Moon, and then there's the Jellicoe Ball. So what we learn in that first poem is once a year, cats gather, this group of cats gather, this clan of cats gather, and it's a night of a full moon. You see that beautiful moon on the set above the garbage dump, and they're there to celebrate the Jellicoe Ball, and then they wait for their leader to come, who is Old Deuteronomy, who is the leader of the group, the leader of the Jellicoes, and each of them tells his story, which is what we see in all of the musical dance numbers and poems that we see. And at the end of the evening, Old Deuteronomy picks one of the cats to go to the Heaviside Lair. And the Heaviside Lair literally means, the metaphor is cat heaven. So the cat will be reborn in the Heaviside Lair and will come back as a new and revitalized Jellicoe cat. That's the story. Okay, so now we've got Grisabella that we can add to the story. So now we have this very strong through line that will take us through the story. I mean, it is not unlike Hello, Dolly. We know when we see Hello, Dolly, you wait 15 minutes into the show with great anticipation until Dolly appears. And in this case, we wait 15 minutes in Cats for Grisabella to appear. She sings a very compelling, mysterious song and then disappears for a while again. But we have our protagonist. We have our central character that will lead us through this story. Okay, so that's what it is. Okay, so everyone is very excited about the project. They have great trouble finding the proper theater to do the show. And keep in mind, in England, aside from the theaters that are part of the National Theatre, where they have thrust stages and arena stages, they don't have that in the commercial theatre in London. For the most part, they're old-fashioned proscenium arch theaters, and that certainly was the case in 1980. Now there are many more examples of interesting and environmental spaces in London, but then that wasn't an option. So they couldn't find an appropriate theater, and by accident, Andrew Lloyd Webber was surprised with a filming of This Is Your Life, and it was done in the New London Theatre. And nobody had been in that theater for years. And it was a theater that was done in the round with a round turntable. And the front rows, the first 6 rows of seats on one side, could open so that there was this wonderful sense of a thrust stage. When you see the show, note that the scenery is really like a sort of amphitheater that encloses this large open round space. We know this is going to be a dance musical, And we know that in dance, it's very vital to have people coming on and off from the wings. So there's a lot of choreography that's parallel or in diagonal lines. But there's always this idea of being able to exit in the wings or come on from the wings. In this case, scenery encloses the space, so the only playing area is sort of a circular area. Try to focus on this as you watch the genius of Gillian Lynn's choreography. She's able to work in the round in a way by choreographing in circular patterns rather than parallel patterns, and the result is really highly energizing and very exciting. But again, she has to keep coming up with new ways of doing it for each song, and just watch how successful she is in the way that choreography is done. Okay, so in any case, they now have their theater. It is now announced, right before they're ready to start rehearsals, everyone is talking about this character, Grisabella, and so they announce that Judi Dench, the great actress, great classical actress of the day in London, in the 1970s, she was the high priestess of all of the Shakespearean productions. We know her now as a movie star, but at the beginning, she was this great classical actress. And so it added great prestige to have Judi Dench playing Grisabella in this production. Judi Dench, the year before, had played Sally Bowles in Cabaret, so she proved her chops as a musical theater performer. So everyone was very excited about this project. On the day of the first read-through, Trevor Nunn spent hours talking about the text. Of course, he's imbued in the classical theater, so in the case of Shakespeare, you always start with the words, and in this case, he started with T.S. Eliot's words, of course, and they're funny and delightful and charming, and they're very interesting characters, cat characters that are created in the poetry. And so Trevor Nunn brings this all to life. At the end of that read-through, he keeps the principal artists and says, there is no 11 o'clock number. We really don't have a show. You've got to have a Don't Cry for Me, Argentina. You've got to have a Hello, Dolly number. And so Andrew Lloyd Webber, at that moment, he writes about it in his autobiography, sat down and said, well, several years ago, I started to work on a musical about Puccini, and I never got very far with it, but it was in the period where Puccini was writing La Bohème, and I wrote this sort of Puccini-esque melody. Let me play it for you. So he plays it, and of course, it will be the music for memory. And Trevor Nunn immediately says to everyone, write this down, write the time, the place that you first heard this melody. It's going to be the greatest song in a musical. And he turned out to be right. Keep in mind, there have been over 600 major recordings of memory, Barbra Streisand's being the most famous. And you know that for 10 years, we could not step into an elevator without hearing memory. So in any case, the song was born then, but without lyrics. Okay, so they proceed, everything goes along, and we get deep into the show, and it's about 7 days before previews, and Judi Dench falls on the set in one of the dance numbers and tears her Achilles tendon, which takes her out of the show. And so suddenly, now they don't have a lead, and the show is days away from going into previews. And so the end result is they contacted Elaine Page, who had played Evita for Andrew Lloyd Webber in London, and made great success with that. And within a few days, they put her into the show as Grisabella. But keep in mind, we still don't have lyrics for the big song of the show. Judi Dench, all through rehearsal, was humming memory, didn't have words. And so anyway, they very quickly hired Tim Rice, who had been Andrew Lloyd Webber's partner, to come back, and they had to forgive all their anxieties and disagreements they had with one another, and he quickly wrote lyrics for the song. However, when they sang the song, it was so dark that the only thing you could do after you heard it was commit suicide. So, here they were, they still didn't have it. So that was thrown out. So Tim Rice is furious that he's been rejected and wants to sue Andrew Lloyd Webber. It's a very difficult time. And in the last few minutes of putting this show together, they found a poem that T.S. Eliot wrote called Rhapsody on a Windy Night. And the lyrics that you know and love from memory come substantially from that poem. So the show would open and be a great success. A quick bit of summary for you. Three of the artists, Trevor Nunn, the designer, and Andrew Lloyd Webber, would all find new brides in the chorus of Cats. And Sarah Brightman would be taken out of the chorus and become the superstar we know as Sarah Brightman with her triumph, in the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical that he did Phantom of the Opera for her. The other thing is Gillian Lind, after the show ran for 21 years, the new London theater was named the Gillian Lind Theater, happily. She would be the first woman, other than being a royal, to have a theater named after her. And then finally, the T.S. Eliot estate would receive over $100 million in royalties from this show, and they now are very philanthropic and give artists all over the world large grants to pursue whatever the new project is. So it's an extraordinary tale. And the one final thing is, some of you remember that a movie was recently made with a lot of famous people in it of Cats by the same man who did the film of Les Miserables. But it turned out to be a catastrophe. And when Andrew Lloyd Webber saw it, he went out and bought a dog. Thank you.